The Scottish Government's named persons legislation has been scrapped 5 years after it was first suggested. The idea behind the policy was to appoint a named person, usually a teacher or a health visitor, to ensure the well-being of every child. But concerns over privacy led to it being branded a snooper's charter by opponents. A Supreme Court ruling in 2016 said parts of the policy breached the European Convention on Human Rights. But campaigner Maggie Mellon wasn't impressed.
I'm pleased that finally the government has kind of thrown in the towel on that one. It was a breach of confidentiality of parents. It was calling for indiscriminate information sharing without consent across a whole range of people and services. And it actually was, as the Supreme Court said, a breach of human rights.
Well, here to discuss are Simon Calvert, spokesman for the NO2NP campaign, and Sophie Pilgrim, director of Kindred, an organisation which provides information, advocacy and emotional support to parents of children and young people with complex needs. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sophie Pilgrim, first of all, how did you feel when you heard the scheme was being scrapped?
I think I can understand people not wanting an invasion of privacy, but I suppose from our perspective, families that we work with have a vast amount of professionals in their lives, and we could see that the intention of the named person was to ensure there was accountability for the well-being of individual children. So I'm sure we'll find ways of supporting young children, but I personally sort of feel that there were strong reasons for the proposal.
So you think it would have been a better solution than, as you say, a number of different types of professionals whose job it is to interact and to look after vulnerable children?
I think the main reason for having the scheme would have been that a few children slipped through the net. And, it would really have been about making sure that children who are at risk of abuse are identified. And when you look at the serious case reviews about children who have come to serious harm, the reason is very often to do with the fact that people didn't want to think the worst and they weren't sharing information about that particular child. So I suppose it's really the balance between, do we as a society collectively want to make sure that we're keeping an eye out for children, and do we feel that's an intrusion in our privacy?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. And Simon Calvert, you've been campaigning against the named persons idea for years. But the idea was well-meaning. It did have the interests of, as Sophie says, vulnerable children at its heart, and an attempt to protect those children who we do hear from time to time have fallen through the safety net.
Yes, I mean, Sophie's right, of course, that we have to be looking out for our most vulnerable children. And she's also right that families with complex needs can find it difficult to get the help they need, speaking to multiple agencies. The named person scheme would not have helped. It does not help in either of those contexts. If the named person scheme had just been a single point of contact for families who wanted help, then that would have been uncontroversial. But the way that the Scottish Government actually legislated for it was, as the Supreme Court ruled, a breach of human rights. It was well-intentioned but disastrously implemented. And so you had a policy where you would have a statutory official with a statutory duty to monitor not the welfare of children, but their happiness. That's what the government defined well-being as meaning. And so when the government was putting its name on leaflets explaining the policy, it would say things like, the named person will check whether your child is given a say in how her room is decorated or what he watches on TV. And the proposal was that officials would gather all of this kind of trivia on families and share it across multiple agencies. The effect of that on child protection would be very dangerous, because if finding at-risk children is like finding a needle in a haystack, it does not help to make the haystack much, much bigger. And that was what the named person policy would have done.
Do you agree with that, Sophie, that while it might have been well-meaning, it was just too vague a concept to be of much use?
I think the point about it was really accountability, because what happens at the minute is nobody takes responsibility for individual children. And the difficulty with saying that it has to be an opt-in scheme, which I think it's now going to become, is that, of course, the parents who which is the vast majority of parents who are very, very well-meaning, are going to opt in. And I suppose personally, I think that, statutory agencies, everybody is very aware that families are the best places for children. Parents are the most knowledgeable about their children's needs. And, I agree with Simon that that's something that has to be respected. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not always the case, is it? I mean, we do hear of some horrific cases where, you have to admit that the parents involved are not the right people and do not know what's best for their children.
Yes, exactly, yes.
Simon, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, that's right, of course, but that's not what the named person scheme was designed to deal with. We have, of course, statutory agencies whose job it is to deal with that kind of situation. We look to the social services and we look to the police. The named person scheme would have been a distraction from that, and we predicted this, and sadly, in areas where the named person scheme was trialled, you have started to see in recent years serious case reviews emerging where they have found that confusion over who was responsible for a child as a result of the named person scheme actually contributed to the problems of children not being identified and children being allowed to slip through the cracks. So as I say, the policy had the exact opposite effect of what was claimed for it. And we can't forget that, health visitors, for example, were deemed to be named persons in this scheme for preschool children. They complained to their union when the union surveyed them, how we meant to take on these responsibilities. Where are we going to find the time? Teachers' unions, teachers too, were to be burdened with all of these extra responsibilities. People who were trained to teach, not in child protection, but they were given all of these named personal wellbeing responsibilities. And again, they said to their unions, how are we meant to do this? How are we meant to teach on top of all these other responsibilities? It was just very badly executed, very badly thought through. And parents were very worried about their privacy being invaded. And again, I bring us back to the Supreme Court ruling. The Supreme Court said that this policy was a breach of the human rights of families. That's a damning indictment for any government. And the Scottish Government has yet to apologise.
Yeah, but I'm sure you have to admit that I'm sure in some cases, teachers, for example, will see things and suspect things that maybe just aren't right in a child's life and will raise concerns. I mean, most teachers would consider that part of their role anyway, the welfare of their children.
The welfare, that's right, and they can and they do, and that's happening already. And the Scottish Government would say that kind of awareness amongst professionals, and they would say that some of the interagency working, they would say, is improving to make sure that concerns are reported.
So where do we go from here? If you say to a named person that
they have to measure happiness of children, that's a quite different proposition.
So what should happen now? Because obviously this idea has now bitten the dust. So what if there are still children and families in Scotland needing support and not knowing where to get that support and help, or children who are at risk in different ways, how do we provide that support that they need?
Well, in practice, if you talk to people like Leslie Scott from the Times Trust, which also works with children with complex needs, they would say that in a family's experience, they tend to come across those people, GPs or other people in the professions, who they recognise get their situation, and they gravitate towards those people, and they get those people to help them get what they want. And I say again that I think parents will be quite happy with a scheme where there was a family advocate, somebody to whom they could go who would advocate for them to help them get the interagency help that they need. Unfortunately, the named person scheme was not that.